Greetings, HW100 students. This is your instructor, James Stevens, and in this audio lecture, we're going to be covering Part 1 of Chapter 4 on carbohydrates. It's one of my favorite nutrients to discuss because I think it's one in which there's a lot of confusion, a lot of maybe fallacies, myths, truths that are spread about carbohydrates, primarily because we live in a, by and large, anti-carbohydrate society or culture, as this cartoon from a few years back demonstrates and illustrates. Probably we're maybe on the tail end of that, at least I'm hoping that we're moving out of this anti-carbohydrate sentiment that seems to be prevailing. But nonetheless, carbohydrates seem to be a source of confusion for many Americans. So hopefully through this class we will dispel those myths and fallacies. So carbohydrates are and this is first and foremost key to understanding carbohydrates, they are a vital source of energy for our body, in particular our brain, which runs almost entirely on glucose, our muscles, which do rely on both glucose that is stored and consumed. Muscles will use some fat as well, but they prefer to use glucose, ideally. And then our red blood cells. Of course, red blood cells have that important job of transporting oxygen. So if you think about just those three parts of your body, your brain, your muscles, and your red blood cells transporting oxygen, think about that and realize how important glucose is as a fuel source. Carbohydrates, of course, are found in grain products, wheat, rice, rye, oats, etc. Vegetables, particularly starchy vegetables like potatoes, sweet potatoes, butternut squash. Fruits, legumes, meaning beans, kidney beans, red beans, black beans, etc. And then also dairy. Now you'll notice when looking at this list of foods that dairy is seemingly the one food that doesn't fit amongst the others because it's animal derived and the rest are plant derived. So how does dairy get carbohydrates in it, and how do the plants get carbohydrates? Well, that all goes back to the process you learned many years ago in a high school, maybe even a junior high school biology class, that of photosynthesis. The sun, energy from the sun, powers this reaction between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the air, and then water to produce glucose and oxygen. Well, if you think about that, well, couldn't we just go outside? Couldn't humans just go outside and expose ourselves to sun, breathe in some carbon dioxide in the air, and just drink some water? We should be able to make glucose, should we not? We have all the right elements. Well, of course, we can't do that, which means we have to consume plant foods, which have the specialized cells that engage in photosynthesis that we cannot. This is an excellent figure out of your textbook that really, I think, helps visual learners to see kind of an organizational chart, if you will, of carbohydrates. So in the next few moments we'll be talking about how carbohydrates are organized. You've probably heard of simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates. And yes, those are two main groups of carbohydrates, or categories, but within those categories we have subcategories. So we're going to spend our time talking about monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. Beginning with the monosaccharides, we have the predominant carbohydrate in the body, which is known as glucose, fructose, and galactose. Now, it's not important that you know these structures for our class. You may be asked to know them for other classes, but it's really outside of the scope of what we're trying to accomplish here in HWE 100. Okay, so glucose. You won't find a lot of glucose in foods as an ingredient in foods, but you will see something called dextrose quite often, at least with more frequency, and that's the same thing as glucose. So we call it generally glucose in our body. dextrose typically when it's in a food, or maybe you've had IV fluids put into your body or know someone who has, and dextrose can be an ingredient in IV fluids or added. So glucose doesn't really exist a whole lot in foods that we eat. So where does it come from? Well, it comes from the process of digestion and the breakdown of bigger carbohydrate molecules, which we'll talk more about later. It is a source of fuel for the cells of our body, the brain, red blood cells, and muscles. And in that source of fuel we call ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It's really better called or referred to as an energy currency. Fructose is another monosaccharide. You may have heard of fructose also called fruit sugar. You may have also heard of high fructose corn syrup, which we'll touch upon later in the part 2 of this chapter 4 lecture series. We don't have a lot of fructose flowing through our body. Okay, I apologize for that pause in the action. So we're talking about fructose. It is the sweetest monosaccharide, that is the sweetest to the taste bud, and that may make sense to you if you bite into a nice, juicy, ripe piece of fruit. It has that sweet flavor. We don't utilize, body cells will not utilize fructose, so the liver, once it receives it, will convert it into glucose, which is the monosaccharide that the body can make use of. However, if we ingest too much fructose, and we would typically do so if we had too many products sweetened with high fructose corn syrup, then the body will convert or can convert some of that fructose into lipid, or also known as fat. Galactose is the third monosaccharide, and this monosaccharide does not exist alone in food for the most part. It is a part of the disaccharide lactose. And once again, since we don't utilize, body cells do not utilize galactose, the liver will convert galactose into glucose. So in addition to the 3 monosaccharides, we also have 3 disaccharides, sucrose, lactose, and maltose. And these are basically 2 sugar molecules that are bound together by a specific bond in between the 2 individual monosaccharides. So it's very important that you know that these 3 disaccharides, sucrose, lactose, and maltose, are comprised of the 3 constituent monosaccharides. Sucrose being glucose plus fructose, lactose being glucose plus galactose, and maltose finally being glucose plus glucose. So let's talk a little bit more about these 3. Sucrose also goes by the name of table sugar. It was once the most commonly used sweetener in the United States food supply, since been replaced with high fructose corn syrup. We also have lactose, which is 1 molecule of glucose and 1 molecule of galactose. This is found only in milk products, and we should be more specific and say that milk products derive from animals, humans, cows, goats, etc., but not the non-dairy milk products. Soy milk, rice milk, almond milk. And then lastly we have maltose, which is 1 molecule of glucose with 1 molecule of glucose. This is not found to any great extent in foods either, but rather it is a breakdown product of starches. Maltose is commonly used as a starting product for the production of alcohol, because you can ferment the maltose, resulting in alcohol. So once again, know the individual monosaccharides which comprise each disaccharide. Glucose plus galactose equaling lactose, glucose and glucose equaling maltose, and lastly glucose plus fructose making sucrose. Let's move on and talk about complex carbohydrates. And complex carbohydrates are subcategorized as polysaccharides, meaning they are many sugar molecules. And there are polysaccharides that are in foods, and then there's a polysaccharide that is in our body. The polysaccharides in foods are further subdivided into starch and fiber, and the two starch molecules are called amylose and amylopectin. About 20% of the starch that we consume in grains, potatoes, etc., is in the form of amylose, and the remaining roughly 80% is in the form of amylopectin. And then we also have fiber, which is within foods. Certain foods we'll talk about more, and fiber is indigestible. So within the amylose and amylopectin, there are enzymes in the human body, namely amylase, which can break apart those bonds between each glucose molecule inside of amylose and amylopectin, whereas this tightly woven and connected matrix of glucose within fiber, we have no enzymes that can break these apart. So there again, amylose and amylopectin are the two predominant starch molecules, and each one of these hexagons represents a glucose molecule. Now we also have another form, another polysaccharide that's found within our body, and that's called glycogen. Glycogen. There's going to be a few more terms related to carbohydrate that start with G. It's important to be able to distinguish between them. So glycogen is a storage form of carbohydrate, more specifically a storage form of glucose. As you see, it has a structure similar to amylopectin in that it's highly branched. And glycogen is found in two places of the human body, liver and muscle. Liver and muscle. Our livers have about 100 grams, and muscles in the vicinity of 250 grams or more. 350 grams or more. So we have, on average, the average person has a total of about 1,800 calories. Now, the amount of glycogen that's stored within muscle can be altered by one's diet and physical activity. So you may have heard of this strategy known as carbohydrate loading or carb loading. And endurance athletes like runners and cyclists will engage in this carb loading strategy along with their exercise programs, and they can actually increase by 100 or 150 grams the amount of glycogen that they store in their muscles. The amount that can be stored in one's liver is fairly set. And there again we see that glycogen is very similar to the amylopectin molecule. Now the reason why this is important is that each one of these endpoints represents an area at which an enzyme can break down these highly branched molecules. So as it turns out, amylopectin and glycogen, although their structures seem more complex, certainly more so than amylose, enzymes actually have an easier ability to break down amylopectin and glycogen at high rates, which is highly desirable for human efficiency and for human survival. In other words, when we eat carbohydrates, because our brain, muscles, and red blood cells rely on glucose, we want to be able to break them down quickly and deliver them from the food to those parts of the body. Additionally, glycogen stored in our muscle, we use that to not only for a fuel source for physical activity and exercise, but even from a survival standpoint for things like outrunning a predator. Okay, so if we didn't have, of course that doesn't typically happen in most people's daily life nowadays, but if we weren't able to break down that glycogen molecule very quickly, then we would never survive. We would never be able to get away from that animal that was chasing us. And then lastly, dietary fiber, again, and we'll stop on this slide for part one, represents an indigestible form of carbohydrate. Again, these bonds are so tight that they are not able to be broken down by enzymes. So you might wonder, well, what makes fiber so important? Why do I hear so much about increasing our fiber if we're not able to access the glucose? Well, that's what we're going to learn about in part 2, is the differences between soluble and insoluble fiber and how they impact human health.